This brownie made me question everything I knew about brownies. It's a recipe that went viral on Reddit recently and is thick and fudgy with a beautiful crackly top. And thus began my trip down a brownie rabbit hole. I spent hours analyzing over a dozen popular brownie recipes, all in order to understand what makes the perfect brownie. We're gonna get into the science behind three main characteristics of brownies. That is their flavor, that signature crackly top, and their texture. And because we're gonna dive pretty deep into that science, I knew I had to call a knowledgeable source about brownie recipes, the queen of online bake-offs, or should I say princess.
Hi, I'm Erika. I am the blogger behind the Pancake Princess, which is a data-driven blog. So I test out a lot of different recipes pretty much every month to find the best.
And Erika has tested at least 30 popular brownie recipes, so naturally I had to ask her opinion on this one.
It was interesting looking at the Reddit post because I think they did a really good job kind of summarizing how the different recipes that they looked at kind of all informed the recipe that they ultimately came up with.
So yeah, let's take a look at this recipe and first dive into flavor. Chocolate is inarguably the most prominent flavor in brownies, and this recipe uses it in two forms, solid chocolate and cocoa powder. And both of those ingredients come in many flavors, so it's important to understand how to pick the one that you'll like. To help you choose in terms of solid chocolate, you'll want to look for a percentage on the packaging. That's an indication of the cocoa solids contained within the chocolate. A higher number will have a stronger cocoa flavor. And as far as the quality of the chocolate,
you can use pretty much any chocolate. Like maybe you don't want to use Nestle chocolate chips in a brownie, but I think like Trader Joe's is probably like one that most people can use, and you're going to get amazing brownies using that chocolate.
And as for cocoa powder, there are three main categories that we use in baking. Natural cocoa is typically the lightest in color of the three and has a very fruity, floral, intense cocoa flavor due to its acidic pH. Dutch process or European style cocos have a darker, sometimes redder color and is alkalized. This cocoa powder has a mellow, very well-rounded chocolate flavor and is the powder I used in almost all my baking. Then there's black cocoa, which is a more intensely alkalized version of natural cocoa. It's the powder that's used in Oreos and ranges from deep brown to black. Flavor-wise, it's best paired with a bit of Dutch processed cocoa. This recipe also uses espresso powder. This, including vanilla, molasses and brown sugar, and brown butter, are flavor enhancers. Chocolate is such a strong ingredient flavor-wise that these optional flavor enhancers help highlight specific flavor notes from the chocolate and make only minor changes in the final brownie flavor. The one flavor enhancer is my favorite because it helps with both flavor and texture, and it's browned butter. To do this, I add butter to a light colored pan and melt over medium-low heat. Almost all of the water is evaporated, and what's left behind are milk fats, proteins, milk sugars, and various vitamins and minerals. As the temperature continues to rise, it's the perfect environment for one of the most important chemical reactions in food, which is the Maillard reaction. The Maillard reaction is a general term to describe a cascade of multiple reactions that brown food. When exposed to heat, proteins and sugars react to create numerous aromatic compounds or flavors that are roasty or caramelly or nutty. These flavorsome aromatic compounds are utterly delicious and responsible for the depth of flavor found in cooked meats, roasted nuts, toasted bread, cookies, roasted cocoa beans, and roasted coffee beans. Probably one of the reasons why chocolate and coffee taste so good together. And most brownie recipes like this Reddit version use a hot liquid to either melt the chocolate and or bloom the cocoa powder. This process is also a great way to intensify the chocolate flavor. What I think is happening is that when the cocoa powder is exposed to hot liquid, it allows flavorsome aromatic cocoa-based compounds that are soluble in fat to mix in the butter. This then gets evenly dispersed throughout the batter, amping up the chocolate flavor. The next step in this recipe is to mix eggs and sugar together. So we're going to talk about how that affects the crackly tops of brownies. For the longest time, it was thought that this crackly top was due to a meringue rising to the top of the brownie while it baked. until Adam Ragusea's video, which gives a pretty compelling argument that this crackly top, or what he calls skin, is exclusively from sugar. And he was able to demonstrate two things. That one, the brownies must contain a specific type of sugar, that is sucrose, the sugar molecule found in white sugar. And two, the sucrose must be fully dissolved within the brownie batter. And you'll see this within the Reddit recipe. We add the sugars to the eggs, beat them on high speed to help them dissolve, and voila, we have brownies with a fantastic crackly top. But when I started developing my brownie recipe, I kept getting inconsistent results. Like the Reddit recipe, I too used a combination of brown and white sugars. I love brown sugars in my brownies, so it was really a non-negotiable ingredient. And so I thought for sure it had to be some magic ratio of brown to white sugar that I could figure out. Brown sugar contains molasses, which in addition to sucrose also has a small amount of glucose and fructose. Too much of these smaller sugar molecules can impede crystallization. That's what's happening to the tops of the brownies. It's a thin sheet of sugar crystals. So I did experiment after experiment, all brown sugar to all white sugar and varying everything in between. I could not figure out why it wasn't working for my recipe. I was about to give up until I gave all of my data one final glance, and I immediately recognized one specific number. It was 200%. And it was in the column that gave me the ratio of sucrose to water. That means in that particular brownie recipe, there was twice as much sucrose to water. And so I leaned pretty heavily on Adam's first two findings to figure out a third. That is, to create a consistent crackly top on your brownies, the batter must contain a saturated sucrose solution. So the key word here is saturated. At room temperature, sucrose can be dissolved in water at about 2:1, meaning 200 grams of sugar will fully dissolve in 100 grams of water, or a sucrose to water ratio of 200%. At this point, the solution is called saturated, meaning adding more sugar at this point will have it fall out of solution. It won't dissolve. When you have a saturated sugar syrup and you increase the temperature, water evaporates and you now have a supersaturated sugar solution. These types of solutions crystallize very easily. What I think is happening with brownies specifically is that when you place them in the oven, the heat evaporates the water, leaving behind sucrose molecules that have crystallized on top or created that thin, beautiful sheet of sugar. And here you can see varying levels of sucrose syrup saturation from 50 to 75%, which have no shiny surface. Then when we hit 100% saturation, you see that the sugars are crystallizing on the surface, all the way up to 150%, where you actually get these huge folds of a sugar sheet. So I realize that most of you probably aren't recipe developers, so I could throw some formulas at you, but that's probably not going to be very useful in the end. So instead, I've compiled a couple tips that will help you maximize this effect on brownies that should have a crinkly top. And the first tip is that if your brownie uses chocolate, make sure to melt it fully. For example, the Reddit recipe uses chocolate and melts it using the hot brown butter. So from all the brownie recipes that I've observed, those that have a nice crinkly top is almost entirely dependent on fully melting the chocolate. Chocolate is manufactured to contain a fair amount of dissolved sucrose. So melting it ensures that you get that saturated syrup into the batter properly and have it on top. And that's why in some brownie recipes that use cocoa powder and then they add chocolate at the end, you'll get a crystallized top that is somewhat patchy or not, like a full sheet. That's because the batter was likely not warm enough to melt all of the chocolate so that the sugar syrup can be incorporated into the batter. And the second tip is to ensure that whatever liquid you're using to mix with the sugar is at least room temperature. And the Reddit brownies, the primary source of liquid in that recipe is coming from the eggs. The solubility of sugar goes up with temperature, or in other words, it's much easier to dissolve sugar in a liquid that is warm rather than at, like refrigerator temperatures. Another good example is Erika's favorite brownie from her bake-off, which is a recipe from Tartine. It has a step where you mix the melted butter directly with the sugar.
So personally, I'm a big fan of that recipe. I think it always guarantees like the glossy top that I think pretty much everyone wants. As long as you get that sugar melted in with the butter, like you will get some kind of like crackly glossy top.
And in my brownie recipe, I take it one step further. In addition to room temperature eggs, I use Adam's clever suggestion of powdered sugar, which dissolves more easily than the granulated types. And as an aside, I like this idea of crackly tops so much that I applied my formulas to my brown butter chocolate chip cookies. Here's the before, which is a great classic chewy cookie, and after modifying, which creates a chocolate chip cookie that not only looks unique, but has this amazingly crispy top to contrast with a super chewy interior. Which brings me to the next section, which is texture. Aside from the fact that brownies are predominantly chocolate, I think another identifying feature is their texture. And there are some generalizations about the type of chocolate that you use and the resulting texture, such as using melted chocolate is the only way to get a fudgy brownie, or cocoa powder brownies are the best. I find that those statements are terribly inconsistent because I can mess with the ratio of other ingredients to give you any kind of texture that you want. That being said, I have noticed a slight trend in brownie recipes. This is a very generalized chart on how specific ingredients can influence texture within different desserts. Take fudge, for example. This blue bar represents the total water content from various ingredients in fudge, and the orange bar is the protein and starches in the recipe. There is more water than structural ingredients, making fudge have a softer and like fudge-like texture. On the other side of the chart is chocolate chip cookies. I'm going to show you the same water level, but check out the structural ingredients. Some recipes have more than double the water content. Brownies sit almost in the middle of these two. They have around the same amount of water to structural ingredients. And what I'm finding is that tailoring this orange bar, or the ratio of proteins and starches to the water, will affect whether a brownie is chewy or fudgy. As for the Reddit recipe, it had an equal amount of water to structural ingredients. What did you feel about the Reddit brownies? Do you think that they're fudgy or chewy, or they're definitely not cakey, right?
Right. I would agree. Okay, that's so interesting. Oh my God, that's so funny. I guess I will pull out mine.
I feel like they get fudgier over time.
Yeah, like the crumb is really dense now. I thought that these were pretty fudgy. I don't think I got a lot of chewiness from them.
Now, many recipes may already have the characteristics that you like, so I'll leave you with this chart that matches up with Erika's bake-off with my predictions. The lower the orange bar, the fudgier the recipe. And as you cross the black line threshold, you could be getting into a chewier texture. And if you want to see my latest interpretation of my perfect brownie after learning all this brownie science, I have my recipe linked down below, as well as the original viral Reddit recipe for you to try, and Erika's blog post that I referenced in this video.